The air at the Henderson County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of July humidity, kicked-up dust, and the faint, sweet smell of curing alfalfa from the field next door. It was 1972. Tractors were lined up like metal soldiers, their paint still gleaming from a morning washdown. Big, green John Deeres with sound guard cabs that looked like something from a science fiction movie, and Case Agri-Kings with their sharp, aggressive lines. They were the machines of the future, the talk of the coffee shop, the subject of glossy ads in Farm Journal promising more acres per hour, more bushels in the bin, more money in the bank. I wasn't there for any of them. My eyes were fixed on a hulking beast tucked away at the back of the line, a machine so out of place it looked like a dinosaur that had wandered out of a swamp and into a showroom. It was a Massey Harris 92 Combine, a relic from the late 50s. Its red paint was faded to a dull, sun-bleached orange, streaked with rust where the rain had pooled over the years. The grain tank was cavernous, the header a full 14 feet wide, a monster for its day. Its engine, a big Hercules Flathead 6, sat exposed to the elements, a greasy, formidable block of cast iron. To most of the men there, it was scrap, an overgrown, inefficient joke. But I saw something else. I saw a machine built when steel was thick and cheap. I saw a simple design, with no complex hydraulics to fail, no delicate electronics to short out. I saw something I could fix myself, with my own 2 hands, in my own shop, something I could own, free and clear. Looking at the museum piece, Frank. A voice boomed behind me, dripping with condescension. I didn't have to turn around. I knew that voice. Dale Peterson. He was 10 years my junior, but he walked around like he owned the county. He'd taken over his father's quarter section 5 years ago, and, with the bank's eager help, had already leveraged it into a 1,000-acre empire. He was the poster boy for the new way of farming. Borrow big, expand fast, get big or get out. I turned slowly. He was leaning against the front tire of a brand-new John Deere 4020, arms crossed over his chest. His sunglasses were a little too stylish for a farm auction, his boots a little too clean. "Morning, Dale," I said, my voice flat, just admiring the craftsmanship. He let out a short, barking laugh. "Craftsmanship? Frank, that thing's a boat anchor. My new 6600 could harvest your whole 320 acres before that thing even gets warmed up. You'd be better off with a sickle bar and a team of mules." A few other farmers nearby chuckled. I felt the familiar heat rise in my neck, the sting of being seen as a relic myself, a man clinging to the past while progress roared by. I ran my place with a pair of 2-cylinder John Deeres, a 51A and a 52G, and a Farmel M that my own father had bought new. They were paid for. Every nut, every bolt. That was a feeling Dale Peterson, with his mountain of debt, would never understand. "It's got good bones," I said, running a hand over the cold, thick steel of the Massey's frame. "Not like the tin they're stamping out these days." "Bones are for the boneyard," Dale shot back. "You gonna bid on it? I might throw a few bucks at it myself. Could use a new culvert down by the creek." The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Haynes, finally worked his way down the line to the old combine. His voice crackled over the portable PA system. "All right, gentlemen, here we have a classic, a Massey Harris 92. She's a big one, a real grain eater in her day. Who'll start the bidding for me? Who'll give me $500? Silence. The crowd shuffled. 500 was a lot for scrap iron. "Come on now, boys, the tires alone are worth that. Who'll start it at 500? I raised a hand, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. "I got 500 from Frank Miller. Now who'll give me 6? Bill's sing-song chant, picked up its rhythm. 600! The voice was Dale's. He was smiling, a predator's grin. He wasn't bidding on the machine, he was bidding on me. He wanted to make me pay, to make me look like a fool for paying too much for a piece of junk. 700, I said, my voice steady, not looking at him. 8, Dale shot back instantly. The other farmers were watching now, a quiet drama playing out in the midday sun. This wasn't about a combine anymore. It was about two different worlds colliding. My world of cash and caution against his, of credit and conquest. 900, I said. That was the number I'd set in my head, the absolute limit. The cash was folded up in my front pocket, worn soft from a year of saving. 1,000, Dale bellowed, looking around for approval. He was enjoying the show. Bill the auctioneer's head swiveled back to me. I got 1,000 from Mr. Peterson, $1,000. Frank, you gonna go 11? I could feel my wife's voice in my head, questioning the wisdom of this. I could feel the weight of the coming harvest. My old Alice Chalmers all-crop harvester was on its last legs. It was small, slow, and another breakdown was inevitable. This Massey, for all its flaws, was a step up. A big step. It was a risk, but it was my risk, not the bank's. I took a deep breath, the dusty air scratching my throat. 1,100. A low murmur went through the crowd. Dale's smile faltered for just a second. He hadn't expected me to go this high. He'd wanted to push me, but he didn't actually want to get stuck with the machine. He opened his mouth, then closed it, shaking his head with a look of theatrical pity. Sold. Bill's gavel cracked on his podium. For $1,100 to Frank Miller. A fine piece of iron, Frank. As the crowd dispersed, Dale walked over. He kicked one of the Massey's huge, weather-cracked tires. You're a stubborn fool, Miller. You just paid $1,100 for a headache. Enjoy your museum piece. Hope you got a good torch to cut it up for scrap when the engine blows. He turned and walked away, back to the world of shiny green paint and easy credit. I stood there for a long time, just looking at my combine. It was mine. The rust, the faded paint, the silent, greasy engine. All of it. The challenge was immense, the work ahead monumental. But the feeling of ownership, of true, unburdened ownership, was a satisfaction deeper than any harvest. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of what it took to bring that old iron back to life, I gotta ask you all something. Have you ever bought something old, something everyone else called junk, because you saw the value in it? Maybe it was an old truck, a tool, a piece of equipment. Let me know down in the comments what it was and how it turned out. It's important to remember these things. Getting the Massey home was an ordeal in itself. It was too wide for the road, so I had to unbolt the header and haul it in 2 trips, my old Chevy C60 grain truck groaning under the strain. I backed the main body of the combine into the darkest corner of my machine shed, where it sat like a wounded giant, leaking oil onto the dirt floor. For the next 2 months, that corner of the shed became my world. My son, Tom, who was 16 that year, became my shadow. He was a good kid, quiet and observant, with a natural feel for machinery. In the evenings, after the chores were done, we'd head out to the shed, the single bare bulb hanging from the rafters, casting long, distorted shadows. The first job was the engine. That Hercules HXD Flathead 6 was a legend, an engine known for torque, not speed. But it hadn't been started in at least 5 years. The oil in the crankcase was thick as molasses. The spark plugs were fouled, and a mouse had built a nest in the air cleaner. "Where do we even start, Dad?" Tom asked, looking at the tangled mess of wires and fuel lines. "1 bolt at a time, son," I said, handing him a wrench. "That's how you eat an elephant." We drained the fluids first, the ancient oil coming out in a black, sludgy torrent. Then we pulled the head. It took the two of us, plus a pry bar, to break the seal. The sight underneath wasn't pretty. Rust had pitted the cylinder walls, and two of the valves were stuck open, caked with carbon. For the next week, we lived and breathed that engine. I borrowed a ridge reamer and a cylinder hone from a neighbor, and carefully worked on the cylinders, the smell of honing oil sharp and clean in the air. We pulled the valves, chucked them in the drill press, and refaced them with a grinding stone, watching the sparks fly. We lapped them back into their seats with grinding compound, working the tool back and forth between our palms until the seal was perfect. We ordered new piston rings, gaskets, and bearings from a supplier in Des Moines, the parts arriving in plain cardboard boxes, smelling of cosmoline. While we waited for parts, we tackled the rest of the machine. The canvases on the header and the feeder house were rotted through. New ones would have cost a fortune, so I bought rolls of heavy-duty canvas and a commercial sewing awl. At night, sitting at the kitchen table, I'd stitch the wooden slats onto the new canvas, my calloused fingers clumsy with the needle, while Tom riveted on the metal buckles. Dale Peterson drove by my place nearly every day on his way to the fields he was renting south of me. He'd slow his pickup down, a cloud of dust billowing behind him, and I could see him shaking his head at the sight of the Massey's guts strewn across my yard. One afternoon, he stopped at the end of the lane while I was welding a patch onto a rust hole in the grain auger. "Still playing with your toys, Frank?" he yelled over the sound of his idling truck. I lifted my welding mask, my eyes adjusting to the bright sunlight. "Just making an honest living, Dale." "You call that living? I just came from the Deere dealership, signed the papers on a new 6600, 6-row corn head, air conditioning, radio. It'll be delivered next week. While you're sweating over that piece of junk, I'll be sitting in a cool cab listening to the ball game and harvesting 200 acres a day." He gunned his engine and sped off, leaving me in a cloud of dust and derision. Tom, who had been holding the steel patch in place with a pair of vice grips, looked at me. "Is he right, Dad? Are we wasting our time?" I shut off the welder and pulled off my gloves. "Son, there are two kinds of farmers in this world. There are the ones who work for the bank and the ones who work for themselves. Dale's got a nice new combine. That's true. But he doesn't own it. The bank does. Every time he turns the key, he's making a payment. We own this one. Every hour we put into it, that's equity. It's sweat, not debt. Don't you ever forget that." By late September, the Massey was back together. We had rebuilt the carburetor, recored the radiator, and rewired the entire ignition system. The day we tried to start it for the first time, my stomach was in knots. We filled the radiator with fresh water and the crankcase with new 30-weight oil. I poured a little gas down the throat of the carb to prime it. "Okay, Tom," I said, my voice tight. "Hit the starter." Tom climbed into the operator's seat and pushed the button. The starter motor groaned, turning the big engine over slowly, painfully. Whoosh, clank, whoosh, clank. It was the sound of a machine waking from a long, deep sleep. It coughed once, a puff of black smoke belching from the straight exhaust pipe. Then it fell silent. "Again," I said. He hit it again. This time it turned over a little faster. It coughed, sputtered, and then, with a deafening roar, the Hercules engine fired to life. It wasn't a smooth, quiet idle like Dale's new Deere. It was a rough, throaty, angry bellow. The whole machine shook, the sheet metal rattling. Thick blue smoke poured from the exhaust, filling the shed. But it was running. I couldn't help but smile. Tom was grinning from ear to ear, his face smudged with grease. We'd done it. We had taken a pile of scrap and breathed life back into it. The first harvest was a trial by fire. The soybeans were ready, the fields golden and dry. We pulled the Massey out into the daylight, its faded orange paint looking a little more proud, now that it was a living, breathing machine. Compared to Dale's new 6600, which I could see working in the distance, it was slow. It was loud. The open operator's station was a swirling vortex of dust and chaff. On the third day, just as I was finishing a pass on the far side of the field, I heard a high-pitched squeal, followed by a loud bang. The whole machine shuddered to a halt. I knew that sound, a main bearing. I climbed down, my heart sinking. Sure enough, the main drive bearing on the separator shaft was glowing red-hot, the grease cooked out of it. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a frantic race against the clock. I had to pull the massive bearing, a job that required a gear puller and a 4-pound hammer. I got it off, jumped in my pickup, and sped the 15 miles to the parts store in town, praying they had one in stock. They did. One. It was sitting on a dusty shelf in the back. I paid for it and raced back to the farm, the sun already dipping low in the sky. As I was wrestling the new bearing back onto the shaft, Dale finished his field. He drove his 6600 up onto the road and stopped, the big machine idling with a confident hum. He just sat there in his air-conditioned cab, watching me, a solitary figure in a broken-down field, covered in grease and sweat. He didn't offer to help. He just watched for a few minutes, then put his combine in gear and drove away. I got the Massey running again, just as the last light faded from the sky. I harvested by the headlights that night, the dust illuminated in their beams like a golden fog. It took me a full week to finish my soybeans, a job Dale had done in 2 days. At the co-op, the whispers were louder than ever. "Poor Frank," they said, "too stubborn for his own good." They saw my struggle, but they didn't see my victory. I got the crop in. I did it with a machine I owned, and when I sold that grain, the check was mine. The next few years settled into a rhythm. The seasons turned, and the work was always there. The mid-70s arrived like a fever dream. Suddenly, the Russians wanted our grain, and they were willing to pay for it. The price of corn, which had been hovering around $1.50 a bushel, shot up to $3, then $3.50. Soybeans went from $3 to $7, then $8. It was a gusher. For the first time in a generation, it felt like you couldn't lose money farming. Land prices went insane. Ground that you couldn't sell for $300 an acre in 1970 was suddenly fetching $1,000, then $1,500. The banks were falling all over themselves to lend money. Their logic was simple. With land values doubling every few years, a farmer's collateral was always growing. It was a sure bet. Dale Peterson rode that wave like a champion surfer. He used his rapidly inflating land value to borrow more and more money, buying up every piece of ground that came up for sale. He bought out Old Man Hemming's 240 acres, then the widow Jensen's 160. He was farming close to 2,000 acres now. His line of equipment became a local legend. He traded his 4620 for a new 4840, a V8 beast. He traded his 6600 combine for a brand new 7700 turbo, and then, a year later, for the top-of-the-line 8820, a machine so large it looked like it could harvest a whole county in an afternoon. He built a new ranch-style house with a 2-car garage and a massive heated machine shed that looked more like an airplane hangar. He and the other progressive farmers would sit in the corner booth at the cafe, talking about cash flow, depreciation, and tax credits. They spoke a new language, the language of businessmen, not dirt farmers. They saw me come in for a cup of coffee, my overalls stained, my hands still bearing the grime from fixing a broken planter chain, and they'd get quiet. To them, I was a ghost from a bygone era, a failure even in the midst of the greatest boom in agricultural history. Dale cornered me at the feed store one afternoon. "Frank," he said, his voice laced with a strange mix of pity and arrogance, "I don't get you. You're sitting on a gold mine. Your 23 acres are worth $500,000 now. You could borrow against that. Buy another 500 acres. Get some new iron. Start making some real money." "I make enough, Dale," I said, hoisting a bag of seed corn onto my shoulder. "Enough? There's no such thing as enough. You gotta grow. It's the American way. You're letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass you by because you're scared." "I'm not scared," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "I'm content. There's a difference." He just shook his head and walked away. The truth was, the boom was good to me too. Those high grain prices meant the checks from the elevator were bigger than I'd ever seen. But I didn't see it as a new reality. I saw it as a temporary gift, a chance to build a fortress. I used the extra money to pay off the small operating loan I took out each spring. Then I started paying it all in cash. I built up my savings account, putting money away in certificates of deposit at the local bank. I bought better seed, put on more fertilizer, and my yields climbed. But I didn't buy more land. I didn't buy a new tractor. My old Farmel M still pulled the planter, and my Massey 92, now a familiar and reliable partner, still brought in the harvest each fall. I knew its every sound, every vibration. I could tell by the hum of the cylinder when I was pushing it too hard, by the rattle of the straw walkers if things were getting plugged up. We were a team. One afternoon in the late 70s, I had to go to the bank to deposit a check. The president, Mr. Henderson, saw me and called me into his office. He was a man whose mood reflected the economy, and right then, he was euphoric. "Frank, good to see you," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. "Look, I've been running the numbers on your operation. You're in the best financial shape of anyone in this county. You've got 0 long-term debt. 0. Do you know how rare that is?" "I like to sleep at night, Mr. Henderson," I said with a small smile. "Sleep?" he boomed, laughing. "You can sleep when you're old. Frank, now is the time to expand. Let me lend you the money. We can get you another half section. Land is never going to be cheaper than it is today. The sky's the limit. We're looking at $5 corn and $13 beans forever." I listened politely to his pitch. He was a good man, and he genuinely thought he was helping. He believed in the boom. Everyone did. But something deep in my gut, a caution learned from my father, who had farmed through the Depression, told me that trees don't grow to the sky. What goes up must come down. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Henderson," I said, standing up to leave. "But I'm happy with what I've got. I know my limits." He sighed, disappointed. "You're a stubborn man, Frank Miller." As I walked out of his office, I passed Dale Peterson on his way in. He was laughing, clapping Mr. Henderson on the back, a thick sheaf of papers in his hand. He was probably signing the loan for another farm, another tractor. He was riding the wave, convinced it would never break. I climbed into my old pickup and turned the key. The radio was on, tuned to the Des Moines station. A newsman was talking in a somber voice. He mentioned rising inflation, interest rates ticking up, and a man named Paul Volcker, who had just been appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve with a mandate to get inflation under control, no matter the cost. I turned the radio off and drove home. The air felt heavy, charged, like the eerie stillness that comes just before a summer thunderstorm breaks. The good times felt a little too good, a little too easy. And I had the terrible feeling that the bill for all this easy money was about to come due. The breaking of the storm was not a thunderclap, but a whisper on the radio. It was January of 1980. I was in the workshop, grinding a new edge on a cultivator shovel, when the news came over the wire. President Carter, furious over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, had announced a grain embargo. No more American corn, wheat, or soybeans for the Russians. The announcer's voice was grave, but I don't think anyone, not even him, understood what it truly meant. At the coffee shop the next morning, the mood was defiant. Dale Peterson held court in his usual booth, dismissing the news with a wave of his hand. "It's a slap on the wrist," he declared to the table of younger farmers, hanging on his every word. "A political gesture. The Japanese will buy it. The Europeans will buy it. The price might dip for a week, but it'll come roaring back. We feed the world, boys. Don't ever forget that." But it didn't come roaring back. The price of corn, which had been flirting with $4, fell off a cliff. It dropped to $3, then $2.50. The markets, suddenly flooded with grain that had nowhere to go, collapsed. The foundation of the entire boom, the belief in ever-rising prices, cracked overnight. That summer, the weather turned against us. A high-pressure system parked itself over the Midwest and refused to move. The sky turned a hazy metallic white. The rain stopped. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by the 4th of July, was stunted and yellow, its leaves rolling up tight like cigars to conserve every drop of moisture. The soybean pods were thin and flat, with only 1 or 2 beans inside, instead of the usual 3 or 4. The earth itself turned to concrete, cracking open in deep fissures across the fields. I watched my crops struggle, my heart aching with the helplessness that only a farmer knows. But I also watched my expenses. I ran the cultivator an extra time to keep the weeds from stealing what little water there was, but the old Farmel M burned just a few gallons of diesel an hour. My costs were manageable. For Dale, it was a different story. His new John Deere 4840, with its air-conditioned cab and 8-bottom plough, was a thirsty beast. His center-pivot irrigation systems, which he'd installed on credit, ran day and night, the big diesel generators at their hearts drinking fuel at a terrifying rate. He was throwing money into a burning building, trying to save a crop that was already lost. The first real sign of trouble came during the harvest. What little crop there was came ready all at once. Dale's massive 8820 combine, the pride of the county, was running from dawn until well past dusk. One afternoon, I saw it sitting silent in the middle of a field. An hour later, the Deere service truck was there. The next day, it was still there. I heard the story later at the parts counter. A sensor on the hydrostatic transmission had failed. Not a big part, no bigger than your thumb, but it was a critical one. It had shut the whole machine down. The local dealership didn't have one in stock. They had to order it from the regional warehouse in Moline, and it was on back order. For 3 precious, dry days, Dale's $1 million operation was paralyzed by a $50 piece of electronics he couldn't bypass, and a mechanic he had to pay $200 just to show up. Meanwhile, my old Massey 92 kept chugging along. The yield was pitiful, barely 50 bushels of corn to the acre, but I was getting it in the bin. One afternoon, the main drive chain for the grain elevator snapped. The links were worn thin from decades of use. I shut the machine down, walked back to the shop, and found a spare length of roller chain I kept on a spool. Using a chain breaker and a hammer, I cut a new piece to length, installed it, and was running again in less than an hour. The total cost was the 30 minutes it took me to fix it. The cracks in Dale's empire began to show. He was short-tempered at the co-op, his face etched with a permanent scowl. He traded his wife's new Lincoln for a used Ford sedan. He put one of his newer tractors, a big four-wheel drive Steiger, up for sale. But in that economy, nobody was buying. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive anger. The wave he had ridden so high for so long was beginning to crest, and the shoreline below looked like jagged rock. The wave crashed in the fall of 1981. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, determined to slay the dragon of inflation, cranked interest rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. The prime rate, the number the banks based everything on, hit an unbelievable 21%. For me, it was just a number on the evening news. I had no loans. The interest rate could have been 100%, and it wouldn't have cost me a dime. My savings in the bank were suddenly earning incredible returns. But for Dale Peterson and a generation of farmers like him, it was a death sentence. Nearly all of their loans, for land, for machinery, for operating expenses, were on variable rates. His payments didn't just go up, they exploded. A loan that was manageable at 8% became impossible at 18, then 21. It was like trying to outrun a locomotive. At the same time, the asset that secured all that debt, the land, was collapsing in value. With low commodity prices and high interest rates, nobody wanted to buy farmland. Ground that had been selling for $2,000 an acre just a few years before was now struggling to fetch $800. Men who had thought they were millionaires on paper woke up to find they were bankrupt. Their debt was a fixed number, but their collateral was shrinking by the day. They were upside down, trapped. Mr. Henderson, the once jovial bank president, was now a grim, haunted man. The federal regulators were breathing down his neck. The loans he had so eagerly pushed were now classified as non-performing assets. He had no choice. He started calling the notes. The foreclosure notices began appearing in the legal section of the county newspaper, small print announcing the public auctions of men's lives and dreams. First, it was the younger guys, the ones who had jumped in at the peak of the market. Then, it started hitting the more established names. Families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years were being sold out on the courthouse steps. A dark cloud of despair settled over the countryside. There were whispers of farmers taking their own lives, unable to face the shame of losing everything. One cold March morning, I saw the notice. The Peterson farm. All 200 acres, the machinery, the new house, everything, to be sold at public auction on the second Saturday in April. The day of Dale's auction was grey and cold, with a raw wind that felt more like November than spring. The crowd was huge, but it was a quiet, somber gathering. It didn't feel like an auction. It felt like a funeral. The farmers who stood there weren't vultures looking for a deal. They were neighbors, watching a tragedy unfold, knowing it could just as easily be them. The shiny green and red machines were lined up in neat rows, just like at that auction 10 years ago. But this time the paint seemed to mock the occasion. Dale was there, standing by the fuel barrels, looking like a ghost. He was thin, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked 20 years older. His wife stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, staring at nothing. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound, crushing defeat. I saw my son, Tom, who was home from college for the weekend, looking at Dale with a mixture of pity and confusion. "I don't understand, Dad," he said quietly. He had everything, the best equipment, the most land. How could it all just disappear? "It was never his, Tom," I said, my voice low. "He was just renting it from the bank. The rent came due." The auctioneer started with the small items first: tools, shop equipment, pickup trucks. Then he moved to the tractors. The massive 4840, the machine Dale had been so proud of, sold for less than a third of what he'd paid for it. The buyer was an out-of-state investment group. The same story repeated with the planters, the discs, the grain trucks. Local farmers, struggling themselves, could only watch as the machinery was scattered to the winds for pennies on the dollar. Then came the 8820 combine. It sat there, a silent, green giant. It looked as new as the day it was delivered. "All right, folks, here's the queen of the fleet," the auctioneer boomed, his professional enthusiasm sounding obscene in the funereal atmosphere. "An 8820 turbo. Low hours, always shedded. Who'll start the bidding at $50,000? Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the machine shed. 50,000 was a fortune no one in that crowd had. 40,000 then. Give me 40. More silence. The auctioneer was sweating, despite the cold. Finally, a man from the investment group raised a finger. The combine sold for $32,000, a fraction of its worth. As the auctioneer cried, "Sold!" I saw Dale flinch, as if he'd been physically struck. That machine had been his symbol of success, his proof that he was smarter, better, more modern than the rest of us. Now it was just another asset being liquidated. My old Massey 92 was parked in my shed a few miles down the road. It was paid for. It was ugly and loud and inefficient, but it was mine. In that moment, standing in the ruins of Dale Peterson's empire, I had never felt richer. I wasn't just surviving. I was secure. My stubbornness, my caution, my refusal to bow to the new religion of debt had been my salvation. The whispers in the co-op had long since died out, replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect. I was no longer a relic. I was a rock that had refused to be washed away by the flood. The last thing to be sold was the land. It was offered in parcels. The out-of-state buyers snapped up the big, flat, productive fields that Dale had acquired during the boom. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel, the original home quarter section. 160 acres, with the house, the barns, the grove of oak trees that Dale's grandfather had planted. This was the heart of it all, the piece of ground his family had homesteaded a century before. The bidding was slow. It started at $500 an acre. The investment group wasn't interested. It was smaller, with waterways and buildings that made it less efficient for their massive equipment. A few neighbors made tentative bids, but they tapped out quickly. The bidding stalled at $650 an acre. The auctioneer tried to coax it higher, but the well was dry. I had spent the morning doing math in my head. I knew what I had in the bank. I knew what this land was worth, not just in dollars, but in history, in dignity. I raised my hand. 700, I said. My voice was clear and steady. A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to me. Dale looked up, his face a mask of disbelief. The auctioneer, surprised, looked at me for a long moment before his professional instincts took over. "I have 700 from Frank Miller. Who'll give me 750? There were no other bids. The gavel fell. "Sold! For $700 an acre to Frank Miller." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a deep, anchoring sadness and a heavy sense of responsibility. I walked over to the clerk's trailer to sign the papers. When I came out, Dale was standing there, waiting for me. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Why, Frank?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why did you do that? To rub my nose in it? To finally prove you were right all along?" I looked him in the eye. "No, Dale," I said softly. "I did it because a man shouldn't lose his home place. He shouldn't lose the ground his grandfather broke. He stared at me, uncomprehending. Here's the deal, I continued. You're going to rent it from me, for a share of the crop. You'll live in the house, you'll use the barns, you'll farm it with whatever you can scrape together. And when you get back on your feet, if you still want it, I'll sell it back to you. For exactly what I paid for it. Not a penny more. For the first time that day, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just nodded, a single, jerky motion, and turned and walked toward his wife. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The community healed slowly. The lessons of the 1980s were seared into our collective memory. The talk in the coffee shop was different now. It was about mending fences, not buying the farm next door. It was about soil conservation, not maximizing cash flow. People started helping each other again. If a neighbor's planter broke down, you didn't drive by and smirk. You brought your tools over and helped him fix it. Dale and I never became close friends, but a quiet understanding grew between us. He farmed the home place with a cobbled-together line of old, used equipment. He worked harder than I'd ever seen him work before. He was humbled, but he wasn't broken. 7 years later, he walked into my kitchen, sat down at the table, and handed me a cashier's check for the full amount of the land. His hand shook a little as he pushed it across the table. I just pushed the deed, already signed, back toward him. We didn't say much. We didn't have to. My son Tom came home from college with a degree in agronomy and a desire to farm. He had new ideas about hybrid seeds and soil testing, but he also had his father's caution in his bones. He saw the wisdom in owning things, in keeping life simple and debts small. One warm autumn afternoon, years later, Tom and I were getting the old Massey 92 ready for the soybean harvest. We could have afforded a newer combine by then, a good used one with a cab and maybe even air conditioning. But we kept the old Massey. It was part of the farm, part of our story. We were greasing the fittings on the header, the smell of the grease gun sharp and familiar. Tom paused, wiping his hands on a red rag. "Dad," he asked, "why do we keep fighting with this old thing? It's slow, it's dusty. We could get a machine that would do this job in half the time." I stopped what I was doing and looked at the combine. The paint was almost completely gone now, faded to a blotchy patchwork of orange and rust. The sheet metal was dented and scarred from decades of work. It looked ancient, tired. But to me, it was beautiful. "We keep it," I said, running my hand over the thick, solid steel of its frame, "because this machine taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about how many acres you farm or how new your equipment is. It's not about what the neighbors think." I looked at my son, wanting to be sure he understood the weight of what I was about to say. It's about this feeling, right here. Your hands on your own iron, on your own land. No notes, no liens, no bank breathing down your neck. We keep it because it reminds us what owned feels like. Truly owned. And that's a feeling you can't put a price on. He nodded slowly, a look of understanding dawning on his face. He picked up his grease gun, and together we went back to work. The quiet squeak of the pump, a steady rhythm under the vast, blue, Midwestern sky. The harvest was waiting.